Great. One. So it's really great that we have a similar introduction to Haiti, actually. When I was an undergrad in 1994, I was the co-coordinator for Amnesty International for my campus chapter of Amnesty. And that was the big year for mobilization to return the democratically elected governor Assis to Haiti. And so I was looking for sources on Haiti, and the book that came in my hands was Uses of Haiti, actually. So Paul's work has been a real inspiration to me personally as an anthropologist working in Haiti. So I was really appropriate. I was really honored. I was kind of writing. I asked around, how do you get to Paul's email? Because he's got lots of emails and very busy. And so I finally got his Gmail account and started like, okay, how do I write this? I just write it. So I wrote it in like 2 hours later. He said, sure, I'd be happy to. So it was really an honor. So thanks for being here on such a cold night. Maybe it's not cold for Boston. It's starting to get cold. So like I said, I started getting involved in Haiti in '94. Then I graduated and I became a community organizer of the Illi tradition, the same tradition that's spawned Barack Obama from Chicago also. And during the time that I was a community organizer, I was laid off because our funder, the hotline for the St. Paul Tenants Union, was the city of St. Paul, and a company that had kicked out 50 single SRO, single room occupancy homeless shelter to expand its business, only to move the St. Paul companies to North Carolina. So being laid off really forced me to think about what I wanted to do with my life, and I decided that I would study the phenomena of NGOs and funding of NGOs. And so also from Chicago, I had to be a graduate student to find out that Dusab, who was the founder of the Chicago, which is the third largest city in the country, is Haitian. I didn't know that growing up. And so I kind of got really interested in why is it that Haiti has been erased from U.S. memory. So I just sort of got hooked. Then I started graduate school in 2000 to study the impact of funding in NGOs, and the place was obvious. I was going to be studying in Haiti. So I went to Haiti. And so this is a period where I did my 20 months of dissertation fieldwork in 2003 to 2005, which those of you in this room who know Haiti know that this was another constitutional crisis. I call it a coup d'etat. I've had argued for that. So this period was when this is the Haiti that I knew best. So I lived in a neighborhood called Criswa, and so I was still trying to do my research, but observing around me a crisis. So that sort of was the introduction. And I introduced the book with February 27, 2004, about having to walk over dead bodies. So I won't get you into that. But I just try to make this narrative that this is how people were living the crisis. So as an anthropologist, my focus was on how people were living this crisis and and what was behind this crisis. And so Paul's concept of structural violence is extremely useful to a lot of us anthropologists, but certainly those of us who know Haiti. So trying to get, why is it that Haiti is erupting in this current, what he would call episodic violence? So I just sort of look at that, and then look at how that structural violence is also gendered, how women are more likely to be poor, more likely to be hungry, more likely to be neoliberalism forces women to pay for housing, for health care, for child care, for education, because the state doesn't do it. So women bear the brunt of that structural violence. And it's also because of gendered structural violence that HIV/AIDS became a huge problem in the last part of last decade. Haiti is one of the success stories for HIV/AIDS, thanks in large part to Partisan Health and their partners. We'll get into, I'd like to have some of this discussion, but working with the government, not around the government, I think is one of the keys to why PIH is so successful. So I was working in 2 NGOs, women's non-governmental organizations. Both of them were Haitian NGOs. They're not international NGOs. I'm not studying CARE, Save the Children, or World Vision. And the women's organizations, they're both working on HIV/AIDS. So they both have about 30 staff. They're both founded in the mid-1980s. So I'm trying to compare the apples and apples here. So the difference is one of them has funding from USAID, and the Global Fund and European Union, the public funding, and one of them has funding from mostly private and European donors. They're like us. They raise their funds through churches, through unions, and through individual donations. So that was going to be the comparative frame. So NGO, what I call Sauver la Vie, which is Haitian Creole for saving lives, has funding, has public funding, and Femmes Ensemble, which means women heads together or women united, they don't have public funding; they have private funding. So this is the basis for comparison. So I walked through the situation using a frame that I call civic infrastructure. Because to me, the concept of social capital, I have problems with, but so as a way to start the conversation, we just need to understand that relationships that people have are not in isolation. So a relationship that an NGO has with the community is not divorced from the relationship they have with their donors. So this allows you to compare this frame as one analytical frame. So guess which of the two NGOs has more participation in the community? Guess which NGO has more autonomy to stand up to their donors? The NGO with USAID funding or the NGO with private funding? So those who know the politics of USAID and how it works won't be surprised to know that the good NGO is in fact the NGO that doesn't take USAID funding. So the question is how that works. So I start on the ground with the relationships between the NGO and the community, and talk about how hierarchical they are, how different they are, and then to try to explain that, I try to write this like a detective novel, going up a level of analysis within the NGO itself, within the staff, the hierarchies that are reproduced between upstairs and downstairs staff. When there's the blackout, the power goes out quite a lot in Port-au-Prince, certainly during this time period. Who gets electricity and who doesn't? I mean, this is a real, where are resources directed? They're directed upstairs. The USAID stickers are on all the computers, and they have to have 5 full-time staff whose sole job is to do reports for USAID, 2 of whom have to speak English because they have to communicate directly with USAID. So you can imagine this is a very top-heavy organization. So then I went to Washington, I went to Brussels, I went to Geneva, where these donors are headquartered, and kind of trying to get a sense of the ethnography of the donors themselves. And so what was behind a lot of this centralization of power and top-down decision-making was what Bush called performance-based contracting. It's called results-based management by other NGOs, or some sort of performance-based model, which is a for-profit model for how to get results. And if you fail to reach your results, then the donor can withhold your funding. So the pressures to perform on a particular numerical calculus are becoming much more intense since the mid-2000s, since 2003 when the Global Fund got started. So these are the processes that kind of squeeze out the spaces for participation and autonomy. And so then in Washington, I was desperately trying to find out, why is this? What's going on in Washington at this period? This is also post 9/11. USAID found a new reason for being after the terrorist attacks. Clinton had kind of privatized USAID by trying to sell the national interest as the economic interest, and so Bush came around in 9/11, development became the third pillar in a 3-pillar strategy for our defense, diplomacy, and development for our foreign policy. So USAID got a lot more money during the Bush years, but the money started to be able to go to faith-based initiatives like World Vision, which is founded as explicitly to convert people to Christianity, to evangelical Christianity. And they were getting HIV/AIDS funding because they're working with churches, because churches are the best people to spread the message. So this is what all this was going on, and I was trying to make sense of all this. And so the theory that I come up with to explain this is what I call trickle-down imperialism. So you have policies that look good on paper. I mean, who can argue against building back better? Who would argue against that we need a world free of poverty, which is, you go to the World Bank, that is their slogan, a world free of poverty, or the fight to HIV/AIDS. So how these policies that are well-intentioned and that look good in Washington or Brussels or Geneva, how they translate into on-the-ground realities that are disastrous, I think is because you have these hierarchical systems that, so I, as an intermediary, the middle person, my only power in this situation is to interpret an unclear mandate from my boss and tell my subordinates that this is the word of God. Because I know that they can't challenge me because it's hierarchical relationship, they have no direct contact with my supervisor. So little by little, you see policies that get translated into, on the ground, they look pretty bad, in fact. To talk about some of the what we can call non-profiteering, about NGOs and their burn rate. There's a term that USAID invented post-earthquake for Haiti. How quickly can an NGO burn through millions of dollars of funding? And this is like written before the earthquake. So this is a more mild, trying to be a conversation about, when you compare two NGOs, one of them has USAID funding, one does not. The realities are different. Why is that? Because of these hierarchies that are inherent in the system. So, I have 3 minutes, 4 minutes. How many do I have? 3 minutes. Okay. So I'm interested to hear what folks have to say and have a conversation. So, so let me just start with each chapter begins with a quote from somebody and then my field notes. So I want to put you right there with me as an anthropologist on the ground trying to understand this. So the quote that begins the conclusion is this: NGOs are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team. That's U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, September 2001. Let me repeat the quote now that you know who's saying it in the context. NGOs are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team. So the conclusion, I begin with my study that I did in the camps, in the IDP camps. Why is it that cholera in the camps, water and sanitation services, why is it that there's a lack of progress? Where there were progress, it was because the government, DINEPA, demanded full coverage in Cité Soleil, and the NGOs stepped up to the plate because they were told to by the government. Left to their own devices, NGOs only added 1% more water and sanitation services in the camps across Port-au-Prince. So it's pretty clear and pretty stark. So I use this as a springboard to have some theoretical conversations about it. I'm going to just read a couple of paragraphs from the conclusion, then briefly outline what I think are some solutions, and then my ending quote, and then we can have a conversation. So, that people are dying of starvation and of preventable diseases and are being denied education is not debatable. The question remains, is this trickle-down imperialism an act of kindness? The title is Killing with Kindness. So the question is it kind? A former USAID mission director had these parting words. So why do we continue to pour our money there, meaning Haiti? The goal is to spend it all and say, see, we've done all we can for Haiti, and nothing changes. It's because of U.S. domestic politics. So the vicious cycle of bad press continues, adding to the stigma and fear which scares investors. Does the system of trickle-down imperialism need to continue? Yvette, who worked for Sauver la Vie, actually, the bad NGO, offers this answer. I would like to tell the American people that they should rise up and tell their government to stop destroying small countries. If the American people revolted and told their government to give small countries the chance to live, maybe the U.S. government could listen. Because I believe there are many Americans who do not know what is happening in this world, who do not know what the American government is doing in the world because of the media. Because I know that many Americans have good hearts. This is what makes them send money. This aid, this generosity is good. So some of the solutions that I offer in the afterward for the grassroots, there's a Haitian tradition of cotisation, of sharing, everyone putting a little bit and doing what you can. And also, by tête nous valait, understand the value that grassroots have. Because the NGOs need the grassroots as much as the grassroots need the NGOs. Because there needs, for their project to work, there needs to be a vital group to work on. For NGOs, I say vise en bas, look downward. So a lot of people really do, people that are the direct contact do know what they're doing, but they don't have the power because of the directors are the ones that have the direct communication with their donors. So one suggestion is regularly share information with the Haitian government. I talk about having using the radio as a way to say not just here's a great celebration every day, but this NGO is working in this province and we're doing this and this and this. Just using the radio as that kind of communication. It's something worth exploring. For Haiti's government, steer, not row. I talk about the the example of Rwanda that Partisan Health had about working with the government is actually more successful in the long run. Talk about having, what little there is could probably, if we're talking about decentralization, having the KAZEC and the AZEC, the 565 section communal, actually have some budgeting authority. 1,000 each is actually $500,000. $1,000 could go a long way in a rural section to build a water pump or to build a grain mill or something. And if they're successful, they can scale up to the point where they can be a direct contractor for donors. For USAID and other donors, I just have a specific list. First, I think USAID should be removed from the State Department. Directing funds toward countries that are based on need, not current security interests. USAID should require NGOs to always include open space for true local participation. Who was there, what was the discussion, and then have that report in the native language, in Haiti it would be Creole, and come back and say, is this what we discussed? Okay, what are the solutions? And so really forcing that kind of dialogue. And there are some NGOs that prove that's successful. I could cite Lobby Fund, I could cite Soil, I could cite other NGOs that are doing that kind of stuff. And the last is for citizens to occupy government. All these changes are not going to go anywhere if we, the citizenry, people that donated to Haiti after the earthquake, just let our check be the last word. The question is, what are we as a humanity going to do about it? What are you going to do to bring about this change? Truly, another world is possible, but only if we recognize that we are all in this together and we act in solidarity with one another. Marie, a former factory worker and current Team Machan, a street merchant, offers these parting words for readers. Before you can talk about helping Haiti, the best way you can help us in Haiti is to bring back democracy to Washington. So, those are my last words.